All right, guys, are you looking to invest in the Columbia Gorge, or perhaps you already are and you're curious about what the future looks like? In this video, we're going to cover just that. I'm Brett Stomps with Windermere Real Estate, and let's get into it. All right, guys, so got a little PowerPoint for you all today. Investing in the Columbia Gorge, a long-term perspective. Okay, so what does the last 15 years look like for real estate in the Gorge? Well, here's a handy graph for that. So this graph goes back, I'll move my little face over here. This graph goes back all the way down to 2011. And you can see here, look at these average prices. Red is average price sold. Green is what the seller was asking. So there's always been a discrepancy here, right? And this is what, if you've been following along with recent videos, this gap has been getting a little bigger lately. So, okay, let's take note. Pretty consistent. What is there really to say about this? Not a whole lot, other than this is where COVID is. You see there's a pretty good increase in average price. And these little dips up and down are mostly seasonal changes. Cool. So 15 years of data. This is what I have available to me. And so far, the Columbia Gorge is on a smooth track upward. All right. So, what makes the Gorge different from other small town markets? Well, personally, I think it's the everyday lifestyle, the location to PDX, the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area, the weather, and the infrastructure. Let's talk about each of these real quick. So, everyday lifestyle. If you're not from the Columbia Gorge, you probably have heard a little bit about us already, and that we have lots of sports you can do here. It is a small community where people feel safe. It's not like this one big city like Portland where, there's different parts of Portland, but it all just sort of blends together. Every little town in the Columbia Gorge is unique in its own way. And this, to me, I feels more village-like. I think something that at our core, we're a little more used to knowing the different communities and what makes them different. And they're a little more easier to understand and be a part of. They're separate in some way, but still kind of together. It's this everyday lifestyle of having a really close community that I feel like gives us a sense that we can really change our environment every day. Not only that, if you really did feel like you needed to get out to the city, or you needed more infrastructure, right? You needed to buy a specific car, stuff like that, get out to an international airport. We're only an hour away. That is a very easy commute if you needed to go for just the day. For example, that isn't so remote that it really doesn't make a lot of sense to do, maybe even on a weekly basis. We have the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area. That is a federal scenic area that is federally controlled and would take an actual act of Congress to change. So, what is the scenic area? Well, you can Google it, and it is this overlay along the Columbia Gorge that essentially puts restrictions on land use and land development in the Columbia Gorge. And it's there to preserve its natural beauty. Then we have the weather. The weather is drier than Portland. It's drier than what most people think of when they think of the Pacific Northwest. But it's also not too dry. We actually live in a very blended microclimate in that we get a really diverse collection of weather patterns. We're right stuck in this middle of really wet and really dry. And so we get a lot of diverse biology too. Then there's infrastructure. So the Columbia Gorge itself, we'll talk more about this later, has a ton of infrastructure behind it. The first and most notable one is the dams along the Columbia River, which produce, I think it was some 25%, like some 25% of all of Los Angeles's power, and a ton up to Seattle and a bunch to Portland. So we have a actual powerhouse of power right here at the river. And not only that, we have a lot of agricultural and timber products as well, which I think I'll get into a little bit later. Okay. So are people buying property here for today's market or for the next generation? And I honestly think it's both. If you're thinking about moving to the Columbia Gorge, you're probably thinking that this is a good place to stay long term, not maybe just something to do for today. Though during COVID, we definitely found a lot of people were wanting just to get in for kind of the sake of it being the cool thing to do, and then later trying to get out. But there's still need for space. There's still the need to escape this rat race, this system, right? And big cities are a lot of work. They're stressful. You know, I grew up in Gresham, which was only an hour from here, but I've had family here in the Columbia Gorge my entire life. So I've had a taste of what the big city's like. And it's just, to me, it's not a good fit. If you're talking about trying to be active every day, out in nature every day, in a slower community where you can kind of keep a tab on people, right? Are they safe? Who are they? Who are these people I'm interacting with? And you're looking for the depth of a community that really makes you feel like going out and about every single day actually is going somewhere, right? I don't really feel like that's as easy in the big city. There's more people, there's more chaos, there's more faces to try and remember. And because of that, I just don't feel like there's this primal connection that we all need and crave in big cities. But certainly there's a lot of opportunity out there. I personally just think the Columbia Gorge is this weird um, sweet spot where we do actually have quite a bit of this large infrastructure behind us where you can have a really successful career while also simultaneously having a very successful personal life all at the same time. Okay, is the Columbia Gorge still going to be a good investment in 2026? I think this is better to be rephrased as, is the Columbia Gorge, yes, still a good investment today, right? Versus was it just a good investment in the 70s and 80s when windsurfing was becoming a thing and house prices were still cheap and it was just like this untapped thing? Personally, I think so. If you've ever traveled outside of the Columbia Gorge or traveled much throughout the United States, there are these little vacation towns that we know of, right? I have a similar experience where I visited Crested Butte, Colorado, and it's this town up in the Colorado mountains where you can go skiing, from your front doorstep, mountain bike riding, things like that. It's a really small town. It's a very beautiful town too. But there are two big things, the two big attractions there were skiing, snowboarding, cross country skiing, and then hiking and mountain biking. That was it. There was no wind sports. There really weren't, there's no wineries there, right? There's no rafting necessarily nearby, though I could be wrong on that one. But, anyways, the houses there in Crested Butte, tiny little thing, like a house in Bingen. Wasn't maybe the nicest home. It was just kind of a shack. $2 million. $2 million was this tiny little shack of a home, maybe 1,200, 1,300 square feet. And I come home from this trip and I'm looking around and I'm like, we have mountain bike riding, we have hikes, we have skiing and cross country skiing, right? And you can't do it from your door necessarily. Some of you can, right? At least for mountain bike riding. But I looked at this and I'm like, this is crazy. This place is $2 million, and you come to the Columbia Gorge, and $2 million gets you a heck of a lot of a home. So much of a home. And then you look at the house that was kind of similar, the ones in Bingen, and you're like, I can buy this for, $400,000 today. So is the Columbia Gorge still an investment in 2026? I absolutely agree. Yes. If you're thinking it's long-term and you think like I do, and that the Columbia Gorge has a lot to offer. So now I have on here some extra notes, right? What about real estate investments? People will buy things emotionally. They'll spend more money for emotional items. But right now, I'm really not feeling like the investment of the Columbia Gorge in terms of like rentals and even maybe commercial businesses isn't that great, right? It's a little inflated for that. And yeah, you can make the numbers work, and some of them really do work. Land divisions still are possible. It's a little harder to find them. Rental properties still work, but you may not be in the market you really want to be in. So I don't always think that rental properties pencil out. And I feel like the stock market has been a little bit more lucrative lately. So a little easier to manage, of course, too. So it comes down to the location. Okay. Will the Columbia Gorge continue to grow over the next 10 to 20 years? So, in my opinion, absolutely yes. We saw on here over the last 15 years, right? Things have not, it's just been going up, right? There's seasonal things going down and all that. But um, with Google, I have just read off my notes here. With Google trying to grow and build more data centers, that's one reason why I think the gorge is going to continue to grow. Whether that's a good thing or not is kind of maybe subjective still, but it's going to bring in more jobs. It's going to bring in more money. The Columbia River is still generating a lot of power. This is my favorite note. So hydroelectric power plants located on the river and its tributaries account for 44% of the total hydroelectric generation in the nation. So this, the Columbia Gorge doesn't just have one, two, or three dams. There's a lot of them. And so in 2012, this is a little bit older now, it amounted to 44% of the hydroelectric generation for the nation. That is insane. Right here, if you live in the Columbia Gorge, you're probably pretty proud of that. But we also have wind turbine farms, right? These supply hundreds of thousands, if not probably millions, of homes with power throughout the area. And then there's solar projects coming in to places like Goldendale. And then there's also the Goldendale Energy Storage Project. That's a hydro pump project over at the old aluminum plant. Give that a search and read up on that. And so a lot of this is actually fueled by data centers right now, but it's always been there, right? The dams have been here for almost 100 years, So something to keep in mind, right? That river is a massive, massive key feature here to why I think the gorge will continue to be a popular area. So the gorge is also still known for its ag and timber. So this on here I found online. Oregon grew 32% of the country's pears in 2020, most of which came from Hood River Valley. There was a time when I spent a bit of time in Florida, and I was just going to the store buying some pears, and I couldn't help but notice the duck wall had pears in Florida. And so I had sent a message over to one of the managers over there, and I'm like, hey, I got a little homesick. Look what I found. And it was this pear from, back home. And here I was in Florida, like could not be almost any farther away from home. Okay. So will the gorge continue to grow over the next time? This is a little bit more continuation on it. Think about the lifestyle desires that people want these days. I think as technology and cities continue to get larger and larger and larger, and we can telecommute, right? People are looking for more everyday recreation, small town communities, visual beauty, and weather. I think we're all really pretty tired of being in a big city, at least from the standpoint of just how busy they are, sitting in traffic, and just being a part of this big machine where you got to go to work so you can come back and afford your home, and just being tugged around all the time, not really able to control what you want to do with your life. Like creativity has just been absolutely squashed lately in the name of production and profit. It's really kind of a sad thing to watch. But when I think of this, like, will the gorge continue to grow? Like we have all this tourism, right? This natural beauty. I look outside and I think, well, as long as the river's still there that I can windsurf on and raft, as long as Mount Hood still has snow on it that I can ski and snowboard on, as long as these hills nearby are fun to hike, right, and have beautiful vistas, and as long as the town still accepts me for who I am and allows me to have a life here, I think people are going to continue to want to move to the gorge, right? For these reasons, these very reasons are just in the nature of it all. Like, how could you really change whether or not Mount Hood's there, whether the rivers are still flowing? I mean, other than just naturally, if global warming, something like that, gets to these features and we no longer have snow and water, is there room for future development? Not that much, actually. And that's my opinion. The Columbia Gorge Scenic Area limits minimum lot sizes, in some cases 20 to 40 acre minimums. The agricultural zoning limits development, right? If you ever take a look at Hood River Valley zoning, like a lot of it is protected by ag zoning, and there's minimums for that too. There's certain requirements that land must produce an income in order to have even housing on it. At that, it's usually worker housing. Topographical challenges limit development. Look over in Stevenson, for example, right? Cascade Locks. People go, I want to buy 5-10 acres in Cascade Locks. It's like, have you looked on a map? right? Like the topography just goes straight up, my man. Like it does not exist. And if it does, it's extremely rare. And if it does, it's going to be a lot of money. Um, so topographical challenges limit development. And by the way, Klickitat County has probably the least amount of this challenge. Same with maybe Mosier, but there's just not as much development out that way as Klickitat County has. And then there's just the cost of development. It limits development. So a lot of people don't realize the cost of labor out here is pretty high because the cost of living out here is pretty high. And so, yeah, future development, it will be expensive and it will be difficult. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see a new bridge one day. Okay. So what are the property types in the last 15 or so years that have been the best? And I pulled that data. So it's going to be your classic 3-bedroom home. That was 55% of the market was buying 3-bedroom homes. And we can see here at the data, right? Yeah, there is definitely average price, median prices. And of course, these bigger homes with more bedrooms are going to cost more money, right? On average. And when we look at the sold price to original list price, this is really what's going to say, hey, what's holding its value the most? And you can see here, it's the 3 bedrooms at 94.5%. So yeah, your 1 bedroom, your 2 bedroom, and even your 4 bedroom are up in the 90s. It's really not much different. There's one house that's a 9 bedroom. That's fun. At any rate, it's your 3-bedroom home, right? It's the most common product that most people are looking for. Okay, what type of financing, just while we're on the topic, is the most common? It's conventional. And I look back again at that 10-year window and a 15-ish year window, and we had 47% of the time conventional financing was used. And then 20%, 27% was cash. So I thought that was really quite impressive. So it's probably easy to say going forward, always about 25% of the time, you're going to deal with a cash buyer. So let's see here too, while we're at it. Sold price, original list price. This is basically how big of a discount are these buyers getting for using this type of financing. And cash, it looks like it's getting about a 2% advantage over conventional. So there you go. Which communities will see the most growth in the next 10 years? Now, in my opinion, and this is really just my opinion only, excluding Hood River, excluding White Salmon, these places are always going to continue to get more popular. But yeah, which ones are the kind of up and comers? And this isn't by no means order of most growth, but Hewsum, BZ Corner are going to see a lot of growth, I think, as people want to be still on a little bit of land, but you're kind of close to Hood River still, close to Mount Adams. Lyle has great views for honestly still a pretty cheap price. And it's only, 10, 13 minutes away from White Salmon. It's just stunning out there. They only need a couple other things to really get that community turning, and that's going to be probably a more established grocery store and a couple other meeting spots. The Confluence Cafe, that bar there, that winery, the cafe, that's been a great improvement to that neighborhood. And we just need probably a little bit more of things like that to make that place just a cool area to be. Goldendale is probably going to grow. I think that is kind of a given how much of the solar energy, solar, wind, and this pump project are going to change Goldendale. We'll see. I kind of put a question mark on that, but I do think a lot of the incoming infrastructure is going to change Goldendale just from a economic job standpoint. And then Mosier. I think Mosier, just being so close to Hood River as it is, and it's just so pretty. I think if the well water situation can really be nailed down out there a little more accurately, Mosier will continue to be a popular spot. Okay, so kind of wrapping it up here, what are my biggest concerns for the next 10 years? Now, this one, again, is just my opinion, but I think how are fires going to shape our landscape? I think about the recent fires that we had here, and the forest takes a long time to grow back from these fires. And depending on where they're at, if they're on the west side, we have a lot more evergreens, right? They don't really stand up to fire too well, like the oaks do here on the east side of the gorge. a lot of them can come back. A lot of them love fire, right? But it still damages the visual beauty that a lot of people come here for. And it just, those areas don't quite feel the same. Next is, where will our working class live? So as home prices continue to be stubbornly high, I don't really think they're going to be dropping anytime soon. At most, significantly, I don't see that ever happening. So it really becomes a question of the people who are serving the tourists, the people who are doing every day very important things, checking our groceries, right? Um, Washing our dogs, things like this, right? Watching our kids, maybe. Um, where are these people going to live, right? As the gorge gets more expensive, where is this housing going to be? And then what'll heat do to our rivers, right? We are very water orientated out here in the Columbia Gorge. And with data centers tapping into that resource, with the dams tapping into that resource, and with what seems to be like a hotter and hotter summer and more mild and mild winter happening over the last few years, right? Rafting. I love rafting. What is that going to do, over the long term if rivers continue to just get less and less water in them? What is that going to do to the rafting community and the businesses associated with it and the people who, once again, rely on that resource? And what is the cost of a new bridge going to do to us? So, I mean, I think the bridge, the last time I heard it was like about $1.2 billion. And they are now delaying it again because there was a misunderstanding of how deep the bedrock was that they needed to do. They needed to drill down for the footers. And it's going to add more money. It's going to add delays. It's going to increase more engineering time. So, what's that going to do? I mean, who's paying for that? I mean, we can look this all up. I have a general idea of how it's all being funded, but I don't want to bore you here. But when that bridge is opened, right? It's not going to be a free bridge. And, you do some number crunching. Who's going to be on the hook for paying that? And how is that going to affect the people who live here in White Salmon and in Hood River? So I wonder, I think about how much money I spend on the bridge a year, probably about $1,000. If that goes up by twice, and I spend $2,000 a year on bridge tolls. What about the companies that drive across it multiple times a day that have multiple employees? So those are things that are in my mind. But anyways, what do you guys think, right? Why do you want to invest in the gorge? And if you've already invested, what are your future plans? I'd love to hear from y'all. So thank you again for always tuning in to watch my videos. I hear that they're helpful and I appreciate you guys giving me this feedback. So let me know. I'd be curious to engage with y'all. Take care.